Well, good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2021 Smith Lecture. I'd like to especially welcome you, whether you are watching online or whether you are here live in the auditorium. So that everyone understands each other, let me just paint a bit of a picture for you. For those online, we have here in the auditorium in Waterloo Studios about 70 guests, and for those here in the auditorium, we have about 200 people watching online from around the country and even from overseas. So regardless whether you're here in person or online, I hope that you really enjoy the evening. My name is Peter Kaldor and it is my pleasure to be your MC tonight. You're coming to the Smith Lecture. So what is the Smith Lecture? I know many of you have been before, but not everyone. The Smith Lecture takes its name after the late Bruce Smith. Now, Bruce was one of those men that if you had him as a teacher, you never forgot him. He was a standout teacher, and I had the joy of having him teach me philosophy at Moore Theological College. And it was out of conversations with Bruce that gave birth to the concept of the Smith Lecture. Recognising that for many people today, we don't typically turn to the Bible as a source or reference point to think through contemporary issues, we felt it would be wonderful to put on a lecture where we could reflect on what does the Christian voice have to say on a topic that is pertinent to our times. And over the past 20 years, we've tackled a great number of topics. And tonight, we're very much looking forward to hearing about the topic of gentleness. I'm especially glad, as always, that members of the Smith family are here tonight. In person, we have two of Bruce's sons, Rob and Andrew's wife, Annette. And joining us online, the third son, Dave, as well as Rob's wife, Claire, which is wonderful that you can be with us. So let me tell you how the evening will proceed, and then we'll get underway with the lecture. I'm going to invite Michael up in a moment to give the lecture, after which you will have your opportunity to participate by questions. Now, the way to do that will be to send me an SMS, and my number will appear on the screen. And there'll be plenty of warning. You'll get that a few times. And online, you'll see the phone number for me. Please do send those questions. You can send them at any time in the talk. I promise I won't watch. I'll listen to Michael's talk. But then send them through. And then after, as soon as Michael's finished, we'll dive straight into Q&A. And we'll have plenty of time for that. After that, I'll invite Dr. Greg Clark, my co-coordinator for the Smith Lecture, to deliver a vote of thanks. We'll present the traditional gift to our speaker and then we'll close the evening. So that's where we're heading. So this evening's topic is the art of gentleness. And I found it quite amusing that they chose to launch the latest James Bond movie tonight, which I gather is called No Time to Die. So quite an interesting counterpoint. There is also a little soccer game going on, and I know some people have been distracted by that, but go the Socceroos. But the Smith Lecture has been going for about 20 years. The very first Smith Lecture was in 2001, held in the Stranger Dining Room of New South Wales Parliament House. The speaker that year was Dr. Peter Jensen, the father of this year's lecturer. So it's a great pleasure that Peter is here with us, but also that we can now introduce his son, Michael, who will give the 2021 Smith Lecture some 20 years later. Who would have thought? So who is Michael? I've known Michael now for 26 or 7 years, perhaps a little longer. I went through Moore Theological College with Michael. Spare a thought for him, his father was the principal at the time. Michael was the standout intellectual student of our year. Perhaps that wasn't too difficult, but it was Michael. Michael is now currently the rector of St Mark's Anglican Church in Darling Point. And Michael is a very accomplished author and academic theologian, you could say. He's published 9 books. He did his doctorate in martyrdom and identity over in the UK. He's also been previously a teacher at Sydney Grammar School. So he comes with a vast range of experience. So this evening, he's going to be delivering the lecture, The Art of Gentleness, a Radical Alternative in an Age of Outrage. Please welcome Dr. Michael Jensen.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone else. It's a great honour to be asked to be giving this lecture in memory of Bruce Smith, who is also my teacher, but I would also say my mentor and my friend. And he was so many great things, so many astounding things. But I was reminiscing just before with Catherine, my wife, and with Andrew Smith, Bruce's son, about how he read our 3-year-old son stories and was really good at doing that. And in one sense that he was the consummate gentleman. And so it is a great honour to give this lecture in his memory and also remembering his particular gentleness. And I want to begin tonight by asking, do we really like gentleness? We say we do, but do we really? Coco Chanel is once supposed to have said, "Gentleness doesn't get work done unless you happen to be a hen laying eggs." It may be good to be gentle if you are going to be a nurse or a counsellor, but what about as a barrister or a business owner? Unpalatable though it seems, it's toughness that gets things done. It's aggression that triumphs. Take the late Apple CEO Steve Jobs. Jobs revolutionised the world of technology not once but many times, driving innovations like the personal computer and the iPhone, just to name two. And as a result, it's not surprising that Jobs has been the subject of business articles and biographies, and that his quotes litter the internet. His success and productivity surely make him someone whose character is worth emulating. But Steve Jobs was widely known as a jerk. His colleagues and friends forgave him his temper and his lack of empathy because of his genius. But one of them wrote, "Could Steve Jobs have been a nice guy and accomplished what he did? Almost certainly not, because then he wouldn't have been Steve Jobs." There was nothing gentle about Jobs. But then, must we accept that a certain amount of ruthlessness is necessary to be an admirable and successful human being? The French writer Anne Dufourmentel puts it this way: "Gentleness is troubling. We desire it, but it is inadmissible. When they are not despised, the gentle are persecuted or sanctified. We think that to be gentle is to be nice, but to be nice is to be insipid, and to be insipid is to be weak. It's a forgettable virtue, and maybe even a bit dull. A gentle person may have qualities that we find a use for, their ability to listen or their nurturing of others, but they can't carry the team. For that, we imagine that we need someone who is a little less tolerant, a little less patient, a little less concerned about the feelings of others. We'd like to be on Ted Lasso's team, but we also suspect that it's Sir Alex Ferguson, the famous Manchester United manager, who actually wins football games. Sir Alex Ferguson was famous for a thing called the hairdryer, which is where he got right in the face of his team and spoke to them, shouting at them so that they felt the hot air of his breath on their own faces. Gentleness is for tending to the wounds of battle, not for fighting it. So perhaps we're in two minds. Is gentleness even a virtue in the first place? The gentle may be sainted, but only in the sense that they are too otherworldly to be any earthly good. It's naive to be gentle, and so this saintliness is really at the expense of others who have to suffer the brutality that the gentle don't have the strength or the will to stand against. What's more, if gentleness means weakness, we're certain that weakness is not virtuous. A person may be nice, but that niceness may come from cowardice. And that cowardice, that fear, may mean that they do not possess the fortitude to stand up for what's right. For the great and formidably mustachioed German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the problem with Christianity was that in praising virtues like gentleness, it was actually endorsing a form of self-hatred, what he called this crushing of one's self, this scorn of one's own nature. In Nietzsche's reading of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus Christ had declared war on the human passions and on the passionate nature of human beings. Jesus had declared, "Blessed are the meek." Now, note that that word meek is the Greek word praus. It's often translated gentle as well. "Blessed are the gentle," said Jesus. And this, for Nietzsche, was utterly contemptible. Wherever Christianity spread, so also extended the victory of the weak and the low-born. The human spirit ought to be allowed to exalt itself, for from its freedom comes forth its true greatness and nobility. Neither, and this would have been another of Nietzsche's complaints, does gentleness apparently have any passion in it. Does the person who is gentle care about anything important? Where is the zeal for justice or for the truth? We admire righteous anger. What's gentleness got to do with that? The 21st century has certainly heard Nietzsche's message and has instead seen the continued rise of the passionately strong. We elect and revere and employ leaders who can send strong and simple messages, even if it means that people are crushed in their wake. In our anxiety about the rapidly changing world, we haven't got time for leaders who are gentle. According to various academic management studies, including one published in the Leadership Quarterly in June 2021, we frequently promote narcissists and psychopaths. Time and time again, we forgive them their arrogance. We bracket out their abuses of their power because we feel that we need that power to get things done, from Silicon Valley to the White House. And I'm sad to say that the church is not immune from this either. So then, gentleness is a virtue that, though we honour it in our sentimental moments, we secretly despise. We despise it for its impracticability, and because it lacks the passion that inspires us to get things done. Our need for gentleness, but we need gentleness. So though we despise it, we need it. Human beings are, in fact, very vulnerable creatures. As Shakespeare's King Lear observes, we are unaccommodated. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal. We defend ourselves from nature, from chance, and from each other by erecting city walls and by building civilizations. And yet we cannot avoid recognising our frailty. Our frailty is not simply physical, though it is deeply physical. We may build an armour of muscle to display our invulnerability or to convince ourselves of it, but a microbe or a gene can easily find a way to dissolve us, as we now well know. We are also psychically, emotionally and spiritually vulnerable creatures, prone to shame and guilt, unable to free ourselves completely from habits that cause us to implode or that erode our happiness. We do not find ourselves to be masters of ourselves, doing even what we know we do not want to do. Who has not found themselves wondering why they yet again did what they in fact did? Despite our frailty, though, the sad truth is that we do not treat each other gently. Our cruelty to one another is commonplace. We could think of dramatic examples of sadistic behaviour, but human brutality can be boringly everyday and routine. You just have to think back to the school playground to recognise the sheer ordinariness of our meanness to one another. We're also extremely judgmental beings, and we don't like to admit that we are. It's one of the worst things you can say about someone is that they are judgmental. But we absolutely love our self-righteousness. There's no greater symbol of our age than the Twitter pile-on, when the mob has found someone who is offended or outraged in some way, and so that they are fair game for abuse and invective. You cannot reason with the crowd in high dudgeon. If we need to be treated gently in our humanity, it follows that it's a good thing for us to practice gentleness with others. But to be gentle is obviously not something that comes to us easily, especially in our ungentle times. I have to say, when I mention that I'm giving a topic or I'm researching the topic of gentleness, I'm often met with sighs. People say, yes, gentleness, that's what we need. But yet, we still live in this ungentle age. We still practice this brutality. Who has the liberty, the freedom, the courage to be truly gentle? The alarming incidence of domestic violence shows just how against the grain gentleness can be. Anger and violence can gain mastery of us and throttle any gentle in us. Some people do seem to be naturally gentle of character, but it does not seem enough to have a human society with some gentleness. The human cost of a lack of gentleness is real, and well we know it. Deeper divisions, more contempt for one another, more anxiety. And yet just telling people to find a gentleness that they don't have within them is a problematic strategy. If I'm not gentle with others, it's usually because I'm afraid, and my fear comes from my expectation that I won't be treated gently. At the core of many acts of violence is a deep fear. What will take the violent offender's fear away? Hasn't he learnt from childhood that the world is a brutal world and that you have to be brutal to survive? We need to be gentle. We need to be treated with gentleness, and yet we are so often brutally ungentle. But it may be that we aren't quite clear as to what true gentleness is in the first place. Is there perhaps a version of gentleness that is more practical and that we could more readily admire? There's a clip from one of Jordan Peterson's interviews in which he wrestles with Jesus' famous saying from the Sermon on the Mount, the one that vexed Nietzsche, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Peterson confesses to having found this saying deeply troubling. How could it be right that the meek or the gentle, if we are to understand the word as meaning sort of weak and passive, how could it be right that they could conquer? It's not only not not true, he says, but it's also wrong. So instead, he says, this is Jordan Peterson, meek is not a good translation. I won't do my Jordan Peterson impression. Or the word has moved, he says, in the 300 years or so since it was translated. What it means, says Peterson, is this: those who have swords and know how to use them, but keep them sheathed, shall inherit the world. That's a big difference. Now, putting aside for now the question of whether Peterson has got Jesus right, you can feel his disdain at the thought that weakness, as opposed to reserved strength, ought to be celebrated. Peterson's Jesus was commanding his disciples to become something like skilled martial artists, trained in the arts of combat with the intention of not fighting. The training and equipping gives the person an aura of strength and even a faint menace. The weapon and the ability to use it is the bottom line, even if the gun remains in the holster or the fists are never clenched. So what exactly is then the quality that we would describe as gentleness? Does gentleness come from having power but restraining it? Is it precisely the knowledge that the gentle person could have chosen to use their power that makes them virtuously gentle? There's something that makes sense here, but something also troubling. It's the restraint that makes this form of gentleness attractive. The restraint, the putting aside of other, perhaps more brutal or aggressive options to pursue a more peaceable course. Now, gentleness in this sense is virtuous because it's a deliberate withholding of power. This vision of gentleness, I think, can have an intense beauty to it. I remember being at a concert in the Sydney Opera House, listening to the 80-strong members of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. That's not that there are 80 strong members, 80 members, it's 80 members strong. That group of musicians can make a deafening sound when it wants to. It can unleash its timpani and its brass and produce a tsunami of sound. But when all that potential is restrained so that every musician on the stage is playing, but playing softly, to be in the presence of that music is the most stunning experience an audience can have. 80 musicians making a small sound together is truly intense. Their sound is the aural equivalent of a giant holding a butterfly. I would say this is an aesthetic gentleness. But is the same true of ethical gentleness, or gentleness as a way of relating to other human beings? The complication here is that to achieve the Petersonian version of gentleness, you need to have power in the first place, which is morally neutral when it's the power of tubas and cymbals, but not always when it comes to human beings in relationship to others. The virtue of relational gentleness supposedly comes from the fact that you could be harsh with a person who has less power than you, but that you choose not to be. But you could. The gun is in its holster, but it's loaded. The biceps swell with evidence of strength. You casually mention your black belt. Now, understood this way, as a restraint of power, gentleness is certainly preferable to being a bully, but can be another way of reminding the underling that they are still an underling. They're very much an underling. However graciously intended, it upholds the existing hierarchy. This is why the word has acquired a connection with nobility, a gentleman and a gentlewoman. They are ennobled, a cut above, a class apart from which they exercise their gentility as much as their gentleness. When I am strong but gentle, I display in a way my ironic strength. That's impressive, beautiful when we see it in the orchestra. But in other situations, it can be morally complicated. Not always, but can be. For example, we are often surprised when we meet someone famous or powerful with how normal they seem. And then we praise them. We praise the celebrity for having good manners, not to be haughty. It's amazing how they turned out to be a really nice, ordinary, down-to-earth bloke, as if this is actually praiseworthy in and of itself. But it's because of the dynamics of the hierarchy being upheld by this form of gentleness. When the politician shakes the labourer's hand and listens intently, or when the Hollywood star treats her staff with courtesy. Who knew? This amazes us, and we praise them even more. It might truly be genuine humility, but it equally might just be condescension. Now, don't get me wrong, it's much better for the powerful to be gentle in their exercise of power and gracious in their treatment of others. But this sort of action does not always involve risking that power. The act of gentleness is enabled by the security established by the person's acquisition of or possession of strength. It is safe to be gentle in this way if you know, and everybody else knows, that you could get away with not being gentle. The power is very much retained. The sword is sheathed, but it is held. It is not laid down, which can give a faint menace to an exercise of apparent gentleness. I won't say it always has that menace, but never forget that the sheathed sword is still an instrument for what? For killing. Its very existence shows that dismemberment has been considered. Must gentleness, however, always belong to the privileged and despised when we see it among the weak? Must we prize gentleness, for example, in men, but not in women? For example, in adults but not in children, in the elite but not in the low-born? What if I have no strength to conceal? Can I then be gentle? And this reveals a problem if we define gentleness in terms of the restraint of power. True gentleness will certainly require the strong to withhold their power, but that is not gentleness in and of itself. Gentleness is more properly seen by looking at the object than at the subject. It's about how another person is treated, whether we are stronger than them or weaker or whatever. When we treat someone gently, we do not seek to assert ourselves over them, to dominate or to crush them. To treat someone gently is to see them in their vulnerability and fragility and yet not crush or break them. They may be physically, morally, emotionally or spiritually vulnerable to us at that moment. We give them what they may not deserve as a human being, but as a human being, they certainly need. Now, this will require different things from different people. But above all, gentleness, that is to say, is a form of love. We'll return to this idea later. But for now, I want to point out something else that emerges from our discussion of gentleness and power. There's an element of risk with true gentleness. There's an element of risk with it. There's a memorable scene in Tolkien's Return of the King, which, for those who didn't get through the first two volumes of The Lord of the Rings, it's after the long battle scenes in the Two Towers. It's the Return of the King, where Denethor addresses the noble Faramir. He says this: "Ever your desire is to appear lordly and generous as a king of old, gracious, gentle. That may well befit one of a high race if he sits in power and peace, but in desperate hours, gentleness may be repaid with death." "So be it," said Faramir. That's the risk. That gentleness may not be repaid in kind. We've already seen how gentleness may be despised. And an act of gentleness may be perceived as a moment of weakness. It might be a response to someone's vulnerability. It makes us vulnerable too and is seized upon by the ruthless. So why be gentle? For me to act gently, I need some kind of assurance that the risk of gentleness is worth it. Faramir's "so be it" is an acknowledgement that gentleness is the right way to be and act in the world, regardless of the circumstances that present themselves. We might say that he has a faith that it is so. He understands that it is right to be gentle because of something that transcends him. There is a bigger truth there is a bigger truth that suggests to him that gentleness is in line with all there is. To be gentleness is risky, and so it requires a confidence, a assurance, a faith in something greater, something or maybe someone transcendent. That is to say, something infinitely powerful and infinitely good, and yet itself gentle. As T.S. Eliot put it with exquisite yearning, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. We could read our very existence as being evidence of a transcendent gentleness. As we gaze deep into the depths of space and look at the light from stars that died millions of years ago, we are overwhelmed by our smallness and our brevity. And that yet the universe has been gentle with us, warming our planet just enough to give us life and giving us the unfathomable gifts of language and self-consciousness. We, poor, vulnerable, forked creatures, can experience ecstasies of pleasure beyond merely the stimulus and response of the animals because we can name things, remember things, and anticipate things, and because we can share things. There's cruelty and brutality in nature. There are fangs and there are viruses and there are fires that ravage the forests. But there's tenderness too. The sheer power of nature has given us a miraculous equilibrium, the famous Goldilocks point at which we find the environment to be just right. For all our anxiety and alarm about our existence, for all our doubts and dire predictions, to be human is to be, as far as we know, uniquely graced of all creatures in the vastness of all things. The mystical English poet William Blake depicted the cruelty of nature via the symbol of the tiger in his poem, Tiger, Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? The tiger has a terrible, truly terrible beauty. The creation of this awesome beast leads Blake to wonder what mind could have conceived of it. But it is the same question he poses when meditating on the gentleness of the lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? The tiger exists in the same world as the lamb. Nature is red and in tooth and claw. But that is not the only thing we might say about it. It is not just red, but many colours. And those colours are found not just on the weaponry of teeth and claws, but on bright wings and mottled hides. As Blake puts it, the one who made the tiger and the lamb calls himself a lamb, for he is meek and he is mild. Though he was an unorthodox Christian, Blake read deeply in the Bible. One of his favourite books was the book of Job, surely one of the most extraordinary works of literature ever penned. Job says this of the Lord God: He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. He covers the face of the full moon, spreading his clouds over it. He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of the heavens quake, aghast at his rebuke. By his power, he churned up the sea. By his wisdom, he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath, the skies become fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent. And these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? It's surely one of the profoundest mysteries of all. As Job peers into the vastness of our universe, can we even begin to imagine the power from which it all came? For Job, this is the being who lit the fires that burnt the stars. This is the God from whom came the great forces of gravity and nuclear fission, the forces of nature which we cannot control. Tsunami, cyclone, earthquake, fire are only glimpses of his sheer power. And here we might be frightened. Are we dealing with the tiger or with the lamb? But as Job discovers, this wild and untrammeled and mysterious power does not obliterate him, but rather restores him and tends to him. The prophet Isaiah puts it this way: a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. He allows the reed that is half broken space, care to mend itself. He does not weed it out, but restores it. The flame that struggles to take hold in the candle, he does not extinguish. He allows time for the fire to take hold so that the candle comes back to life. As we stand naked before the raw power of the universe itself, is it too much to hope that at its heart is a profoundly loving gentleness? That gentleness itself runs with and not against the grain of the universe. From a Christian perspective, the gentleness of the Almighty God provides the assurance that gentleness is not weak or ineffective, that it is worth the risk. Turning to Him, we may find the very gentleness that we need as vulnerable creatures, and the promise that gentleness lies in the future, for the meek shall inherit the earth. It wasn't long after his death in 2003 that it wasn't until long, I should say, after his death in 2003 that I became aware of Mr. Rogers. I don't know if you've heard of Mr. Rogers, but Fred Rogers was the American TV host much beloved for his long-running program for preschoolers. Now, Mr. Rogers is called Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood. He was later made much more famous, as anyone would, because Tom Hanks played him in a movie about his life. Now, Rogers was an unlikely TV star. An ordained Presbyterian minister, he wore, as you see, a tie and a cardigan and parted his hair on the left, faintly resembling an accountant or an office clerk. But he had a particular genius for engaging children, not just so as he could entertain them or exploit them, but he actually listened to them, conveying to them a powerful respect, the respect of an adult. One of the most celebrated stories about Mr. Rogers concerns a boy who had cerebral palsy. The boy had been given a chance to meet his TV idol. When he did, at first he was too overwhelmed to even come forward. When he was finally ready to face the great Mr. Rogers, Rogers said to the boy, "I would like you to do something for me. Would you do something for me?" The boy said, "Yes. I would like you to pray for me. Will you pray for me?" This was a boy who was forever being helped and prayed for. He was always the needy and the powerless one. And yet this truly gentle man asked for his help, for his prayers. Reading accounts of Mr. Rogers' life, you get the sense that this was not a clever trick, but absolutely genuine. When asked about the boy later, Rogers replied, "I didn't ask for his prayers for him. I asked for me. I asked him because I think that anyone who has gone through challenges like that must be very close to God. I asked him because I wanted his intercession." Now, Rogers was not cheesy or sentimental. He knew that life can be hard and that people can be mean. He was brave enough to speak to children about death, about racism, and about divorce. He fronted the cameras after the Challenger disaster in the mid-1980s to explain to America's young people what had happened. This was Mr. Rogers. And yet he understood, really understood, and exemplified what gentleness was, though he more often used the word kindness. He once wrote, "Most of us, I believe, admire strength. It's something we tend to respect in others, desire for ourselves, and wish for our children. Sometimes, though, I wonder if we confuse strength and other words like aggression and even violence. Real strength is neither male nor female, but is quite simply one of the finest characteristics that any human being can possess. This strength is not the opposite of gentleness, but is found, as we see in Mr. Rogers' example, within it. In Rogers, this strength came out in his attention to be calm and humble in the face of the distress and the anxiety of small children. Not surprisingly, Fred Rogers was a man who tried to live by the Sermon on the Mount and who tried to live by imitating the one who composed it. And the accounts of the Gospels depict Jesus of Nazareth as a picture of just this gentle strength, of humble power. These are his famous words from Matthew's Gospel. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus is a leader. He puts a yoke on those who come to him, but this is a different model of leadership. Jesus is no Steve Jobs, no Alex Ferguson, but one in whom you might find rest for your soul. He is gentle and humble in heart, which makes his yoke light. But notice that this mild Jesus is neither weak nor without passion. He cares for holiness so much that he overturns the tables in the temple. He has an inner resolve. Toughness and controlled anger in a just cause are not the opposite of gentleness as we see them in him. The point of his gentleness is not to remind us of the sheathed sword menacingly hovering over us, but to show us that he has come bearing news of peace and reconciliation. And passion. It's that very word we use to describe Jesus' journey to the cross. The passion of Jesus was his suffering and death. And we don't use the word here in quite the same sense as Nietzsche used it. But Jesus' life was certainly not one of puritanical renunciation of all the good things of life in favour of a dry spiritual alternative. Jesus, we are told, was filled with compassion in the most visceral way. He anguished and he grieved and he loved and he wept. He was not driven to the cross by a stern hatred of human life, a denial of all that is good in it, but for genuine love of it. His death was not a passive and pious failure to give a damn. His gentleness was born of precisely the opposite. It was the love of human beings that made him gentle, because it was gentleness that we needed. And that observation remakes our understanding of gentleness, because the focus is, as we've already said, not so much on the virtue of the person who's being gentle and whether they are withholding strength and how much. The point is rather that gentleness is virtuous because it recognises and addresses with care the vulnerability of the other person. Christ shows us how gentleness is essentially a form of love. With Jordan Peterson, you feel as if he's advocating praus, meekness, gentleness, as a sort of ironic display of strength. For him, the gentle will inherit the earth because they carry loaded weapons. With Jesus, everything is shaped by the object of his gentleness. Even his great displays of strength are formed by his compassion at the plight of those he meets, the fear of his disciples amid the storm, the hunger of the great crowd, the torment of the blind and the lame and the possessed. Even his acts of power are framed to gentle ends, since they are moulded from love. In particular, Christ's gentleness is expressed in forgiveness, dramatised as the Gospels tell the story in his death. The burden that he carries for us is not just our anxiety and our trouble, it's our wrongdoing. Forgiveness is a sublime form of gentleness. There is nothing insipid about it, nothing weak, nothing gutless. It has the strength of bearing with the wrongs of another, of taking upon oneself the cost incurred by someone else. Morally speaking, being wronged gives us the right to exact retribution. But to forgive is to forego this right. As Portia says in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy is not strained, but droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. Well, thus far I've argued that despite our ambivalent feelings about gentleness, gentleness is something that we need as vulnerable beings. That gentleness is a form of love that recognises the vulnerability in others and allows for it rather than exploits it, allows for healing and growth without crushing the other person in their gentleness. That gentleness requires, but is not defined by, the strong withholding their strength. My claim is that gentleness is risky, and so we need the assurance, or rather the faith, that it has some transcendent basis, that it is more than simply a calculated strategy for success, but is fundamentally right. And I've shown how, in biblical faith, the divine being himself constrains his power within his gentle love, inviting undeserving human beings to share in his divine life and providing the assurance for them that gentleness is a virtue ultimately in tune with existence itself. The meek, the gentle, will inherit the earth, and so they are blessed. Now, it's true, so they tell me, that gentleness will work as a strategy for success in business, in sport, and in relationships. Increasingly, this is quite interesting, management and leadership literature is challenging the belief that gentleness is ineffective. But we do need to avoid the sheer pragmatism of our age, which calculates everything by league tables and balance sheets. Gentleness is not right because it works. It works because it is right. And so it challenges us to reconsider the very nature of success itself. If we are assured about the risk of gentleness, then how can we perfect the art of gentleness in an age of outrage? I have 4 strategies to suggest. The first is that we ought to focus on what the other person needs, since this is the nature of true gentleness. The truly gentle person finds their gentleness emerging from observing the vulnerability of the other person. One fundamental principle of the Bible's view of humankind, one that I think is amply confirmed by empirical evidence, is that we are all frail. Frail as summer's flower, we flourish, blows the wind, and it is gone. And we are in dire need of gentleness. The point is that in our relationships, whether in business or anywhere else, when we understand the vulnerability and neediness of the other person, we will treat them with gentleness, even perhaps when we are saying a firm and necessary no to them. It would be quite possible for the teacher to discipline the rude and out-of-control student with gentleness, without the raised voice or without undue harshness or humiliation, for example, or shaming them, with a realisation that the student has a difficult home life and is hungry for any kind of attention. I can imagine a magistrate likewise delivering a sentence to a convicted criminal in such a way as the criminal is upheld in their dignity as a human being. Secondly, allow for healing and for second chances. My goodness, we have lost the art of giving people second chances in our world. We do not treat the weak and the broken with soft hands. And yet we ought. It is so easy to crush another person. Perhaps easier than we imagine, since we are so afraid of being crushed ourselves. Those we meet may be deeply damaged and may operate from their hurt. In fact, those who seem the most aggressive and strong may be those people. To be treated with gentleness when all you have met in life is fierce, crushing aggression is transformative. This is especially true with that form of loving gentleness known as forgiveness. But we don't always see the wounds that others bear. So preoccupied are we with our own shames and hurts that we can't always see that in someone else. It's also difficult, isn't it, to see through the fog of our own feeling of offence. Could we put the readiness to be offended down for a second and instead inquire about the vulnerability of the other? Thirdly, even when creating a strong boundary, we should do this without cruelty or shaming the other. As one book I read recently by the journalist Ian Leslie, a book about conflict, he says, "Give face, do not take face. Give face, don't take it." I was struck by that. If being the pastor of a church has taught me anything, is that human communities sometimes need clear boundaries to be safe places for the vulnerable. Sometimes we have to treat someone with strictness in order to treat another with gentleness. To treat someone firmly but gently gives them every chance to engage with you because it makes clear there is no threat to them if they do. Fourthly, respond to anger with gentleness. Anger is extremely toxic when out of control. There is, of course, a righteous anger, an anger that has its place. But so much of our public discourse is characterised by rage. The Bible advises us to use gentleness when we deal with complex human relationships, and in particular, as the Proverbs say, a gentle answer turns away anger. The response of escalation when someone else is angry almost never works. Outrage begets more outrage. Look, it's banal to say so. I feel kind of weird saying it because it's so obvious, but we keep doing it this way. The anger of another person can, of course, be very frightening indeed. It's meant to be. But the peace and restraint shown by the gentle answer exposes anger. In its very tone, it is a speaking of truth to rage. Certainly, to be gentle is not to hold off on the truth. It is not gentle to speak mealy-mouthed and dishonest words that turn out to be a trap. But to speak the truth does not mean being harshly direct. We can speak truth, but not from a position of superiority. So in our dog-eat-dog world, perhaps it is not true that our only choice is to be one of the dogs. Gentleness is a courageous and strong form of love that we as vulnerable human beings need from others, but are so often afraid to give. Can you afford to risk being gentle? We can if we have the assurance that gentleness wins in the end, even as it may change what we think winning means. As Christian faith sees it, that assurance stems from the divine gentleness expressed in the words of Jesus. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened. Who is not? And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. The questions are coming in fairly thick and fast.
Oh, dear.
So this is your opportunity. If you haven't yet asked a question you'd like to, the number is very clear, 0409 457 259. Please do send in your question. So, Michael, for budgeting purposes, we have about 20 minutes, but if we're done earlier, we're done earlier, but let's see how we go. So we have a question first up, really in your ballpark, I'd imagine. It's about literature. I think it was Hemingway who said, "True nobility is not being superior to others, but being superior to one's former self." Does true gentleness perhaps therefore require an acknowledgement and understanding of our own failings?
Wow, that's a great question, and in one sense, it's just a great comment. I think Hemingway, famously, in many ways, one of the least gentle of all authors, brash, masculine, very unfashionable these days, loved the bullfight, and fishing, killing things, basically, celebrating the toughness of masculinity, though such a conflicted figure. In one sense, he did not receive gentleness in his own life. I think there's a real wisdom in what he says here, in that, and it goes to humility too, self-understanding means knowing your own, the capacity to be vulnerable means knowing your own, the capacity to be gentle means knowing your own vulnerability, I think, because you're then able to see it in other people too. So I would agree with the quotation there. I mean, that takes a long time. I don't think that comes easily though.
Well, a related question perhaps, can you illuminate us on the partnership or relationship of gentleness with humility?
They're very closely intertwined, and it's interesting that they're sort of fruit of the Spirit. They're both related to Jesus. This is in the New Testament. Again, they're very unfashionable virtues. It's interesting that the New Testament kind of highlights them, and by the way, applies them, supposedly feminine virtues, to both the genders in the New Testament, whereas in the pagan world, these are sort of to be humble. This is kind of it's beneath one to be humble, and gentleness not particularly an affirmed virtue. And I think they are certainly related. They're related in Jesus because you need to think of yourself less, and so therefore, in order to be focused on the other person, in order to treat them with gentleness, to lay down in particular your fear and your fear that you will miss out if you are somehow gentle, or the fear that you will be crushed by the other person. So that does take courage in that. Interestingly, courage and humility are partners when they may not have seemed to have been at first blush. We think of aggression and courage as partners.
We've received a few questions, so I won't read them all out, but they're asking really about the relationship between gentleness and self-control. Can you comment on that?
Gentleness and self-control. Again, they're fruit of the Spirit in the New Testament in Galatians, and so they have a relationship between them. I guess it does take a kind of self-mastery, which is very difficult. For Christians, we call on the help of the Spirit to remake us. So we ask for spiritual help in being remade, so that in particular we might master our anger, because anger is so much the opponent of gentleness. It's interesting how often anger is seen as the passion. You see these lists of vices in the New Testament, and you see unruly passion, and everyone, of course, thinks it's about sex. But often it's actually really about, it's as much about the unruly anger that wells up within us. And I think overcoming that is through, and we need self-control to do that in order that we be gentle with others.
A question from within the audience here. How do you separate the perception that gentleness equates to weakness?
Could you repeat the question?
How do you separate the perception that gentleness equates to weakness?
How do I separate the perception? I think I've tried to do that tonight by showing in particular the courage that gentleness takes because of the risk that it takes. I do think, by the way, it's a battle I have with myself because I'm a coward, and so sometimes I can be nice and gentle, but it's just because I'm gutless, right? Full confession here. This is a great therapy session. Thank you very much. And so we shouldn't kind of baptise those that cowardice and niceness and call it something virtuous like gentleness. I think the true gentleness, the strength of true gentleness, as I say, is it doesn't fail to speak the truth. That's quite crucial. It's linked to truth, and it's also, as I say, it is other person-centered, a form of love, and so therefore it risks the self. It risks it in that vulnerable moment. It risks the self, but for the sake of the other. That makes it strong. That's what Mr. Rogers is. It's quite a strength to Mr. Rogers. He risks being seen as. Mr. Rogers, he's just this sentimental fool, isn't he? He's a children's presenter. How could you possibly take him seriously? And yet I think he's a very serious piece of humanity, Mr. Rogers.
Maybe flowing on from that question, it might have prompted this thought, but harking back to the Chamberlain era, Peace in Our Times.
I was wondering which Chamberlain. I wondered if it was the Zaria or... Okay.
Yeah, no. Chamberlain.
Neville Chamberlain, before the Second World War, yes.
Yes, famously saying peace in our time. Was that risk worth it?
Now, that's interesting because I think the appeasement before the Second World War, easy to be wise after the time, after the events, but there was a form of cowardice in that, right? And I don't think gentleness is simply cowardice. So gentleness says no. It can say no, and it can say no quite strongly. But what it doesn't do is dehumanise. So I think, I think it's important not to swoosh gutlessness here with the word gentleness, and therefore not, and in particular it's those conditions. Saying the truth is necessary and it can be done gently, but it still needs to be done. And that truth can sometimes be, I say no, and I stand here and I'm going to wear what it takes in order to prevent you from doing your evil, because I'm going to protect others who are vulnerable too. So again, I was talking about even just in the church community, which is not like the Second World War, just do want to say that, but you do have to sometimes be quite firm with some in order to be gentle to others, to make sure that the vulnerable are protected.
Well, maybe applying that in a business setting, because there's been questions here around how do you address narcissists in a corporate environment. People seem to have experienced that a little. Do you have any advice there?
How do you address narcissists in a corporate environment? I mean, there are scads and scads of papers written about this because we're all of a sudden working out it's a problem. But I think the thing about corporate and business and workplace environments and churches too, I mean, even narcissists deserve to be treated with some kind of gentleness and with the possibility of second chances. But I think I hate to say it, but the administrative business of kind of setting out guidelines and kind of actually framing the values of your workplace ahead of time, naming what's not good behaviour, having that conversation really kind of hopefully heads the narcissist off to the past, so that we don't accept this here, because we want to be in a workplace in which we encourage gentleness. I also think that when we make decisions about who leads our institutions, our big corporations, it's not good enough to say, look, yeah, he upsets a few people, but, you know, he gets results. He'll defend the truth doggedly. You know, it's okay. You know, we'll kind of paper over those things. No, I think actually that's not, we can't do that. I mean, I really think, I'm only going to speak for church organisations, we can't do that anymore. I just don't think that was ever a Christ-like way. I really hope that message gets through into the business world as well.
Slightly different
and politics.
Yeah, slightly different tack here. Why is society today so easily outraged? Have we become overly sensitive?
Why is it so easily outraged? Because it's frightened, because it's increasingly divided, because it's lost a moral compass, and so it's finding another moral compass. When you find this other moral compass, you have to uphold it because you're afraid that it's always shifting. So you've got to stake your claim somewhere. So I think outrage is a way of doing morality in a kind of morality-less society. And so I think it's quite puritanical in that way, in the worst sense. Actually, I think the Puritans weren't quite as bad as puritanical. So I think that sort of puritanical behaviour comes from this uncertainty and then sort of going for further certainties. A big division in how we do morality. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, is a fabulous account of this from a point of view of moral psychology, which is really a term he invented, I think. A terrific account of how good people disagree vehemently on things, on questions of right and wrong. And I don't want to blame the internet because everybody does, but the social media giants love it. They're making billions of us shouting at one another. So, you know, that is there. And there's a lady called Professor Zuboff, who's Shoshana Zuboff, wrote a book about called The Age of the Surveillance Capitalism, which, in a very scholarly way, shows how basically we're stuffed because of to put it politely, because of the way in which our whole social discourse is being framed in order to reap profit from us through this division. And we've just got to protest but through gentleness. We've got to actually respond by not doing it. And that's going to take self-control. It's going to have to take reassurance, the confidence that gentleness is better.
Okay, this questioner takes us to the tragic scenes that we all witnessed at the Kabul airport before the final collapse of the city. It was chaotic and tragic. The Afghan people saw the small window of opportunity rapidly closing and maybe not likely to reopen for a long time. Hope seemed to be squashed. When people lose hope, do they also lose the ability to be gentle? Does gentleness only exist where hope exists?
That's a beautifully put question, and I would sort of, I agree. There's an act of, well, I think I say yes. I think without hope, it's very difficult to be gentle because of the risk. Well, you have to believe that gentleness is, as I say, with the grain of the universe. You have to be with Faramir, saying, so be it, because you have some idea that it's transcendence. You have some hope there. But without hope, I say, don't be gentle. You know, there doesn't seem to be any ground for it.
Mm. Well, speaking of the ground for it, this next question flows, I think. A quote from Mir Kahan: above all, it is not decency or goodness or gentleness that impresses the certain areas of the world, but strength. Question is, do you think that the message of gentleness transcends culture, or is this something that only is appealing within the Judeo-Christian influenced Western society?
I'm going to say I don't know, because I can't really give a good account of the extraordinary and sophisticated moral landscape that exists in India or in China, just to name two enormous civilizations. And I don't have to hand an account of gentleness in the other religious traditions either. So and I couldn't really comment on those. I would say that the Judeo-Christian tradition certainly has the resources in it to find this, but the Judeo-Christian West has been quite ruthless and ungentle with the world, and so I think it's perhaps through something of a sense of shame that we might be returning there, or a sense that it hasn't really, it's worked in some circumstances and not worked in others. Yeah, the question itself is I think should stand. Yeah.
Well,
it's more explanation.
There is a question that, again, possibly follows from that, though. Any comments on the gentleness and the incarnation? Was God in Jesus sheathing his sword, or was he coming to us unarmed?
That's a great question. It's a disarming question. Sheathing his sword or coming to us unarmed. If you think of Philippians chapter 2, Jesus casts off the trappings of heaven. So there's a sense in which the incarnation, he takes the form of a servant. So he goes to the cross. He doesn't, when he's arrested, it's Peter who wields the sword, not it's not Jesus. Jesus put away your sword. Would you have done this? And wouldn't that have been a hopeless? You would have lost anyhow. And he's taken. The very point of the incarnation is he's taken, arrested, tried, and then crucified, and without military. He's not a military. He certainly puts aside that. Is it the sword sheathed? Of course, we see his power. We see the flashes of the divine power, demonstrations of it. But as I say, it's very often for tender ends. So these are signs that demonstrate. I think I want to say he comes unarmed to us, but make no mistake that the creator of heaven, who I believe is in Jesus Christ, the creator of all things, the power of the universe, the engines of the suns, etc., has that power, and that is a power that is a power with which we must reckon. In Jesus, we see that power approaches us and is for us and invites us and says, "Come to me."
Because I have a different question here. Is God gentle? He often seems very angry, not gentle.
Yes, I think God is. I think God is angry and gentle, because I think righteous anger and gentleness are not necessarily the opposite. They're kind of attributes of the same, consistent attributes of the same God. I don't think God is cruel. I think God is strong. And I think God, when he exercises, is gentle, as the strong must do. I think he restrains himself in dealing with us. I think we see that in the creation. I think it's interesting in Job. I've been looking at Job in my Bible study group. And in the book of Job, you've got this, God is a pretty ornery character in the book of Job. He's complicated. And Job's very afraid of him in many ways. But then at the end of the book, God speaks to Job and says, I'm more powerful than you. Don't forget it. You didn't make the world. But he does so in such a humorous way that it actually restores and heals. It's delightful, this picture of the world. He talks about the ostriches and the crocodiles, and he makes jokes, and in the end restores Job at the same time as he reminds him that he's the power behind it all.
Slightly different tack here. I might combine two questions, sort of related perhaps. Michael, can you tell us about a time in your own life, a personal experience, where you felt close to God, just like Mr. Rogers? And a general question, Michael, thanks. How do you learn how to be gentle?
A time when I felt close to God. There were a number of times that I felt close to God. I felt close to God in... sometimes I feel close to God, sometimes I don't feel particularly close to God, or sometimes I forget that God's there and then remind myself. So I felt close to God in moments when I've been shown forgiveness by others. Particular moment I don't want to go into. I have felt close to God in sorrow. I felt close to God when I felt overwhelmed in particular circumstances. I felt close to God in visiting the deathbeds of people and praying with them and not knowing what I would say, but finding words to say. Because that's never, no one ever gets used to. I don't think you ever get used to that sort of situation. I have felt close to God in seeking his forgiveness too, I think, in seeking his mercy. What was the second part?
It was, how can we learn to be gentle?
I think we can learn to be gentle through experiencing gentleness. So it's by being open to receive the gentleness of, and in particular, I think as Christians, we think about receiving that from God, understanding his treatment of us in our vulnerability is the model. And as we understand ourselves treated like that, with gentleness in our vulnerability, then we understand what it is to treat others in that. It's no mistake that forgiveness, as it's taught to people in the Bible, is always forgive others as you've been forgiven, right? You learn to forgive by realising that you have been forgiven, and I think that's true of gentleness. And I think also habit is really important too. So the practice of restraining, of coming to those points of this is what I found lately, by the way, on social media is those arguments that you have where you all of a sudden it becomes a matter of beating the other person. If you catch yourself and say, no, that's really ungentle and actually deeply, this is harming the world, right? So stop it and give the other person face, and see it as a constructive conversation, not a destructive conversation, not a win-lose conversation, but what potential win-win is there? I've found opportunities to do that really make me pause and have helped me learn the habit of gentleness, in particular in those kind of debating situations.
There's a question here, women are often conditioned to be gentle and mild. Do you think it's much easier for a woman to be gentle than a man?
I think we expect it. I'm not a woman, so I can't say. Although I would say we expect it from women, and so then we get, and so we feminise the virtue, which shows, I think, that's why we kind of think it's for nurses and not for doctors. We see that as something women are better at doing. I'm not saying that, that's what I think our cultural habit is. So, but as I say, I don't think it's really interesting how the New Testament doesn't genderize those. It actually calls on men to be humble and gentle just as much as women. It might be a culturally different place to come from. I think masculinity does not readily teach us that gentleness comes, that there is a strength in gentleness. And so we could find better masculine models that show us that strength that comes from within gentleness, that are appealing and still masculine, still male.
This is going to be your last question. So well done. You've raced through 20 minutes or so. Yes. Well, we'll see. Well,
you're the marker.
So, question, and this perhaps ties together some of the things you've mentioned in your talk, particularly the quote you put on the tiger and the lamb. Could you please put your opinion of what is meant by the lion laying down with the lamb, the picture in the book of Revelation?
Oh, yeah.
Is the lion sheathing its sword and the lamb also sheathing its fear, or do you have another take on it?
The lamb is sheathing its
fear. So how do you understand the lion and the lamb?
Well, the lion and the lamb. The lion becomes a vegetarian, or the lion sits down at the lamb dinner. I think that's a wonderful picture from the book of Isaiah. It's kind of picked up in the book of Revelation. It has these remarkable images of the harmony, the kind of futures, it's symbolically done. The sort of harmony of the creation that nature itself will be shorn of its redness in tooth and claw. It will lose in some way its savagery, and so it's symbolic of those. And so I think that's what it's pointing to. I think yes, the lion is sheathing its in that picture. Of course, the lion is still a lion. That's the point. And the lamb is still a lamb. That's the point. There's still a disparity. We would expect to see these two at odds, and yet in the picture of the new creation, the new heaven, the new earth, there is a deep harmony and reconciliation, a peace. Shalom is of course the Hebrew word, which is so far better than the word peace, because it doesn't just mean laying down of your arms or kind of coming to a truce, which is what we do when we have peace, but actually a profound reconciliation of all things.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note of hope that we can finish on. So let's thank Michael again for his lecture. Yeah, sure. Just one. I'm going to call on Dr. Greg Clark to give a brief vote of thanks. Greg is my co-conspirator in planning the Smith Lecture, and he'll come forward and deliver the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for those incredible questions. Before I thank Michael for his address, it obviously stimulated a really wide range and complicated sort of series of responses. I was actually reflecting on the Ernest Hemingway quote in the first question, knowing as I do that Hemingway famously got into a public brawl with the American poet Wallace Stevens, where they both punched each other in the face. And I was wondering whether he wrote the quote after or before the fight, and where he'd got to on the issue of gentleness, but we're all works in progress on that front. Michael, from Coco Chanel through Steve Jobs, through Nietzsche, all the way to the words of Jesus, you've given us an incredible address on the nature of gentleness. And I think it's been a sort of cultural tour, I guess, through the artefacts of gentleness as they've been represented to us. I think it's been a complex topic. It's a difficult one. And Michael, you've explored it with great erudition and care. Not mere niceness. We're not talking about niceness, but there's something nice still about the gentleness that you've presented to us. It's not something weak, but something that's giving. I also reflected that it's not something that is often sought by people, but it's something that's incredibly necessary, and you emphasised that. I was intrigued by the idea that gentleness is in fact somehow powerful, And there's a lot to reflect on there, and that in that paradox, we do find something profound that we need to solve, some sort of gentle power or powerful gentleness that we want to seek. And I also love the notion that to be gentle is to be risky. The two are not put together enough, I think. There's something kind of there's a radical risk-taking element to being gentle. And then Michael's brought those ideas together for us in the discussion of Jesus, his focus on Jesus, a lamb and yet a lion, even a greater being than the tiger that William Blake was talking about. And there at the end, I couldn't help thinking of the image from C.S. Lewis's great novel, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when the lion raises back to life and children are riding on his back as he gambles through the fields. And there's something gentle and powerful at the same time about that image. C.S. Lewis gets it right so often. But also there's a great sacrifice involved in that gentleness that Jesus has presented. And I guess on today, Remembrance Day, that's a powerful message for us to hear. And I think we need your 4 tips. We need the pragmatic tips about how to be more gentle. It's a practice and a discipline that we are seeking because it doesn't always come naturally. So thank you, Michael, for this countercultural call to courage, to be gentle but strong, and I guess to see in Jesus something worth emulating, maybe even worth worshipping. Would you please join me in thanking Michael Jensen? And my other happy duty is to call up Andrew Smith with the customary gift to the Smith lecturer.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Andrew. Yours.
Well, just now in closing, again, thank you, Michael, so much for your preparation and your delivery of tonight's lecture. Thank you for everyone who has attended, both in person and online. The Smith Lecture is an activity of Third Space. Can I encourage you to go to the website thirdspace.org.au, where we have a wealth of resources and activities and other live events that you can be exploring in a safe space these sorts of questions. That's the purpose of Third Space, that's the purpose of the Smith Lecture. So I hope that you take the opportunity to dig a bit deeper, and you can see on the screen some of the different networks that you can also get involved in if you wish. In my final duty, it's really to thank a number of people. I'd like to thank Michael and Alex on the camera, and Ryan and Josh up in the control room there, and my son Tom, well done. And also those behind the scenes who have helped, Janelle, Sue and Ken. Thank you very much for your work. And thank you to the Waterloo Studios who have very kindly hosted us here tonight. Well, I hope there's much to ponder that you can think through long into the night and beyond. Please do take the opportunity to discuss what you've heard with those that you've come with, or with others if you've watched this alone. I hope that you can join us, God willing, for the Smith Lecture in 2022. Stay tuned for what that may be. Otherwise, I wish you a great night.